All right, can everyone hear me? So, thanks, CJ, for the wonderful introduction. It's really my pleasure to come back. I haven't been back to Grasp and Penn for a number of years. And so it's great to see kind of all the new facilities and to see, and I'm hoping to see some of what you guys are working on here at Grasp these days. So today what I wanted to do was tell you a little bit about thinking about how we can look inside AI boxes, and in particular, trying to understand them from the perspective of neural representations in geometry. So that's the focus of my talk today. So, here's an outline of what I want to cover. So first, I would just want to give you a historical perspective in terms of some of the kind of recent commercial successes of robotics and AI, and how we got here, and some of the role that we had here at Grasp. In particular, we're seeing kind of how we have to scale very large neural network models. So to really get a kind of more foundational understanding of these types of models, we want to understand what's happening inside these systems. And so that's why I want to talk about neural representations. And in particular, I want to try to explain to you how to think about these things in terms of high dimensional statistics and geometry, and how some of those insights can lead to better models and hopefully future AI systems that will continue to improve robots. Okay, so that's what I would like to cover here today. And feel free to ask questions anytime. Let's make this as informal as possible. Okay? All right, so let's talk about robots. So this is kind of some of the crazy robots that you can see today. So, this was just last month, right, or a few weeks ago in China. They had a Lunar New Year show, and you can see kind of the kind of progress we've made in humanoid robots. So here's the video of that, right? So let's see if I can play this. Right here. You see, right, you have Unitree's humanoid robots. They're doing these amazing dances. They've been highly choreographed to do these types of motions, but the kind of agility and the kind of legged locomotion that you're seeing, and also some of the kind of, sword kind of play here, right, is kind of incredible to see these robots do this kind of at the dexterity and agility of kind of what a human dancer would kind of do. So this is kind of really incredible that we've seen this kind of progress. But we should be proud that actually at Grasp, we had started a lot of this humanoid research. A bunch of us here were working on legged robots for a long time. Dan Kodacek, other folks here for a long, long time were thinking about how to really make legged agility. And so one of the projects, that I know well is, human robots at Grasp. This was kind of a team of Grasp students. This is a team that we had called the UPenalizers for UPenn. This was actually started by a Grasp faculty member named Jim Ostrowski. Jim actually came from Grasp, and then he went on to go to Blue River Robotics, where he's now, making robots for agriculture for John Deere. But he had started this team. I was involved as well, and this is kind of a video clip showing back, back in 2011, we had a team of small humanoid robots that were trained to play soccer, and you can see what they were able to do at that time, right? So this is all completely autonomous. We had to learn how to walk, you have to learn how to kind of manipulate the ball, how to kind of coordinate. Hopefully, this is not so great coordination, but, coordinate their actions to play soccer. You can see at that time, 15 years ago, this is the Grasp robot here. He's about to take a kick, takes a shot. This is actually, I think, a team from Japan. So the Japanese goalie makes a diving save on the ball, right? And then he gets up, and their goalie doesn't know where the ball is. And so now you can see the Grasp robot here comes in, kicks the ball into the net, right, and scores the goal. And so we went on to win this world championship match at that time, right? So this is something that, really did start at Grasp, and you've seen now in 15 years the progress we made in humanoid robots. So that's one, I think, example of kind of how quickly commercial robots have developed. So now let me give you another example, right? Drones. Okay, so this is actually a video of a show that was held in Seoul, South Korea last year over the Han River there. This is what they can do with drones these days, right? You can launch basically, thousands and thousands of drones. They're coordinated, they fly up, they're positioning themselves, and then they can make these shows, right, where they're basically putting on these displays, right? So this is Korea, so they're doing K-pop displays with drones, right? So they're showing, kind of how these drones are coordinating their flights, and then they're able to automatically launch, do the show, and then come back and automatically land. and recharge and then basically go on to their next show. Right, so this is the kind of amazing drone technology that we've seen on the commercial side here in terms of being able to make these fabulous displays. Okay, so this is where we are today. But you should realize, for those of you who don't know, that this stuff actually started here at GRASP as well. Okay, so this is actually back in 2012. Actually, Alex Kushlev here from KML Robotics and Vijay's group, right? We're working on swarms, quadrotor swarms, and this is what they were able to do at that time, 14 years ago. Right, so here these were all home-built quadrotors then. You couldn't buy them from DJI at that time, so we built them here at GRASP. You actually put them together. You had the positioning systems, your controllers, all the IMU control, all the IMU-based kind of estimation, and then you fly these quadrotors together. And at that time, you can make these three-dimensional formations, which was the first time people had done that with drones. Right? So this is, again, something that started from scratch here at GRASP, and in 14 years has become this thing where they're doing shows all over the world. Right? So this is where we are at. At that time, you could also do these, this first time people were flying these very dynamic patterns with these drones. So you could see that that was actually the start of that. Okay? So that's another technology that was kind of ingrown and developed here. Here's another example. Autonomous vehicles, right? So today you can go, and if you go to Los Angeles, you can rent a ride in an Alphabet Waymo vehicle. If you own a Tesla and you can buy the package, you can try the full self-driving mode. Lots of other companies are in this space, right? So you can see that autonomous kind of vehicle technology has gone to the point where all these companies are basically competing to try to sell you their service to let them drive you somewhere. Okay, but again, as CJ mentioned, this was actually here at GRASP, we were one of the first teams that were able to do this autonomous driving. Ani Shea was involved with this. John Spletcher, who was CJ's student, who was a professor at Lehigh at the time, had helped also on this project. Again, you couldn't buy an autonomous vehicle, so we had to build this all in-house here at GRASP. We took a Toyota Prius at the time and basically modified the steering wheel, the brakes, all the controls that you had on a stock-built Prius. We put a bunch of Mac Minis in the back, a couple LiDAR sensors on the top of the car and on the hood of the car, and then basically had the software, the intelligence to try to drive this car around. So this is what it looks like. This was actually during that Urban Challenge back in 2007, so almost 20 years ago. This is during the competition. This is the Penn car basically coming up. This is actually a human driver in front of it, so it sees the human driver. It slows down. Now it gets to a four-way intersection, and at that time, these four-way intersection, if you know your rules of the road, whoever gets to the intersection first has a right of way to go through the intersection. So there is actually another car here. That's another robot car that we're waiting for to go through the intersection, but something's wrong with their intelligence, so they're not moving. So then the rules were if you waited 30 seconds, you could then go out of turn if the other car didn't move. So now we're going to turn on a right turn blinker. Our car then makes a right turn into the lane here in a couple seconds. It'll make this turn. And then the problem was there's another robot car during this time that made an illegal maneuver. So we make a pass through this immobile robot, and there's another robot going the wrong direction in our lane. So here the human drivers are going, these robots don't know what they're doing, so this robot's stuck. So then the human driver backs up. That gives us enough room that our robot immediately puts in a pass maneuver, goes around that robot, and then continues to complete the rest of the course. It was like 50 miles of driving to finish this, right? So that was what happened back in 2007, and that was, I think, a lot of the motivation for these companies that you see here today, right? So that's kind of three little vignettes of kind of where research comes from, basically academic settings like here at Penn, where there was actually zero commercial interest in any of these technologies. And within 15, 20 years, they're now trillion-dollar industries, right? So this is something that hopefully you guys are thinking about, is what will be the next one coming out of GRASP. That's what I'm encouraging. All right? So what I want to say is you should be proud of where you are at GRASP. One of my roles I always enjoyed was to organize GRASP reunions and parties for us. You can see kind of you always meet alumni from all over the world who are coming from this lab. And it's all thanks to Ruzhina Baishi, who started this. She had a little lab here, back when she came to Penn. This is a photograph of her and her students in front of the ENIAC at the time. I think they were fighting for, probably one flop of computing back then. So this is, where we all started from, and we'll see where you guys can go from here. All right. Okay, so that's hopefully a little historical perspective on robots and grasp role in robot development. But I also want to give you a little bit of historical perspective on where AI has come in these years in the same amount of time. So for those of you who don't know, or too young to remember, or wasn't even born, right? AI started, kind of the first wave of AI was in the 80s. It was really a hot topic back then. It was all based upon kind of rule-based systems, right? So humans writing down rules and logical rules that AI should follow. That's kind of how it started. And then, for those of you who don't remember, in the 90s, there was something called an AI winter, and AI became a super dirty word. If you were someone doing research, if you wrote AI in your proposal, it was banned, just like mRNA research is banned today. It was banned back in the 1990s, right? So that was when I first started getting interested in AI. And then what happened was, in the 2000s, we started going away from rule-based systems into more statistical-based systems for AI. This is the statistical machine learning era. And then really what happened was it scaled into much, much larger kinds of connectionist networks, and that became deep learning in the 2010s. And now you've seen this kind of progress into LLMs and diffusion models and what's known as generative AI today. Okay, so that's been kind of the progression. And so again, it's remarkable progress in terms of what these systems can do, in terms of what we can model and generate, things that were unheard of, 20 years ago in terms of the types of data that we were using. Okay. So all this is predicated on really building larger and larger neural network models. Here's some examples of these models, right? Kind of the canonical ones are these deep neural networks, or deep convolutional neural networks, where you can build a lot of parameters into these networks that take some sort of high dimensional input, like an image, and output some sort of classification or some properties of that object at the output layer, right? And what we're seeing is that the trend has been to build more and more flexible models. So less about, back in the 80s, it was all about humans trying to write down what the model should encompass. And what the trend has been today is that you try to use as little prior knowledge as possible and try to build that into the model so that it's as flexible as possible, but then you have to give it a lot of data for it to learn, right? That's been the trend. Okay, and that's seen by these kinds of curves, which is all about how these models can scale. So the power of scaling. So scaling in terms of how much data you use, scaling in terms of the number of GPUs you're using, scaling in terms of how much time you're giving it, right? So, right, what's basically been seen is that bigger is better. That's kind of the basic principle here. So the more computation, you get more accuracy on certain benchmarks. The more computation you use, the better, again, performance you get in an LLM. So these are all the kinds of things that we're seeing in these machine learning systems today. All right. Okay, but what's the problem with this approach? Right, if you think about being able to feed data, one problem is that if you want to feed data to these systems, think about where your training data comes from. It comes ultimately from humans, and humans do not follow Moore's law. So what you're seeing here is actually there was something called Moore's law for humans. It's called Malthus's law, but that just stopped, right? In many countries, they are actually having population decreases now instead of population increases. So what you're seeing is that there's going to be a saturation in actually the number of humans on the planet. So we can't count on human-generated data to train AI systems anymore. And basically, AI systems today have sucked up basically everything on the internet, like all generated human knowledge for the past, history. So the question is, if you want to improve, where are you going to get the data sources? And people don't want to give their data OpenAI and Meta anymore, right? So again, it's hard to do this. So that's one aspect of this. So we need to have a more principled approach in trying to improve things in the future. And other kinds of things are, we don't really have a good fundamental understanding of these large systems. So here's just a simple example of that. This is something known as a double descent phenomenon, which is the idea that, as I increase the complexity of a system, the kind of traditional view in statistics is that you have something called a bias variance trade-off. And so what should happen is that as you increase the complexity of a system, your generalization error, your generalization performance will get, the error will go down. And then as you increase the complexity, it'll go back up, okay, due to your kind of variance error. So that's the idea. But then what you see with these systems is that if you increase these complexity and you go to even larger scale neural networks, you start to get better generalization performance. Now, but that comes with some caveats. You have to properly initialize the neural network. You have to use the right learning rates at the right time. All these things are necessary in order to get this kind of double descent phenomena. And it probably has to do also with the type of data you use. So no one really understands how to really do this in general. There's no theory about this that really explains what is being used in practice. And so this indicates that we still have a long ways to go in terms of trying to understand these larger scale systems. Another kind of example of where we lack understanding is, for example, everyone uses these kind of denoising diffusion models today to do these generations. And the way denoising diffusion models work is you start with, say, a clean data sample, and you successively add Gaussian noise to that. That's the forward diffusion process, essentially. And then you learn kind of how to reverse that. So you're learning something called the score function of this noise process of the densities. And then what you then can do is you can show that this is kind of using the Fokker-Planck equation in time reversal that you can then regenerate the original data. That's kind of the idea with these denoising diffusion models. However, if you look at this, analyze this, if you know anything about scientific computing and these kind of partial differential equations and ODEs, you know that you really have to be careful with the time step size that you're using when you do the simulation, the reverse simulation. And what you should expect is that the number of time iterations you really need to do this denoising should go exponentially with the dimensionality of your data set, okay? And that's not what happens in practice, is that when they actually run your image generators, you don't have to do this exponential time stepping. You can do something simpler and it still seems to work. So that's a question, is why does it still work in practice, even though kind of theoretically you should expect this kind of scaling to be killing you in terms of the number of time steps. So these are all kinds of indicators that we don't really understand fully what's happening inside these systems, okay? So now I want to kind of go back and try to explain what kinds of things we would like to have in terms of some sort of more fundamental theoretical understanding of these neural networks. Okay, so let's just go back to the basics here. So the way we think about our data sets, right, is we have some data vector that comes in our data set. We think about this as a high dimensional vector. So, right, the simplest example would be an image where each pixel is a component of this high dimensional vector. Another example is, the first step of an LLM is you take some sort of input token, input word, and you convert that into a high dimensional embedding vector, right? So everything that comes into a neural network, you can just think about as a point in some high dimensional vector space, all right? And then we have to think about what is happening to these set of points, in my data set, what does it mean in terms of what's the set of points that we have? And so how do we characterize this, right? Kind of, this kind of the geometry of these points. All right. Okay. So let's start with kind of the very fundamental example. So this is actually the first neural network that was invented. This is Frank Rosenblatt, who invented this in the 50s at Cornell. He was a Cornell electrical engineer. And he just had a model where you have some input vector and you take some set of weights, you sum them, you threshold them, and you have some output that's kind of a logical output. Okay. And this was called a perceptron, right? This is kind of the first biologically inspired model of a logical neuron. That's what it was. Okay. So now, what do we understand about even this fundamental neuron that we can have in a neural network? Okay. And this has to do with geometry, right? So if I take a system where I take this input, I multiply it by some weight vector, and I threshold this, geometrically, what is it doing? It's defining the weight vector is defining some sort of normal vector in this high dimensional space. And what's happening is you're classifying points according to whether they lie on one side of a high dimensional hyperplane or on the other side of a hyperplane. Okay, that's all it's doing, right? So this logical neuron is just trying to see which points lie on which side of the hyperplane. All right. Okay, so then this asks the question, when do we get something where we can separate things with this hyperplane? This is called linear separability. So suppose I gave you a training set with a whole bunch of high dimensional points, and there's labeled, kind of various ones are positive examples, others are negative examples, and you have this perceptron classifier. And this is the same thing that actually happens at the output layer of any neural network that you have. The output layer of an LLM, the output layer of a transformer, the output layer of your deep convolutional neural network. You have these output layers, which are just these neurons. These are linear classifier neurons that are basically trying to separate using softmax or whatever kind of decision rule, which category each of the inputs are at. Okay, so it's very applicable for any type of network. And what we want to understand is when we can take a training set, take these examples, and then be able to say, I can classify them into these two different classes. Right? All right. So this was actually theoretically well understood. It goes back to Tom Cover, who was actually a famous information theorist at Stanford. And he showed that you could actually count the number of separable dichotomies. That is, if you give me p points in some n-dimensional space, among these p points, there's 2 to the p different types of binary labelings, right? Each point can have, can be labeled positive or negative. So 2 times 2 times 2, p times is 2 to the p different types of labelings. And he wants to count among these 2 to the p labelings, how many are actually separable by a hyperplane, okay? And he showed that, this problem is analogous to the pi slicing problem in mathematics. So the pi slicing problem is the same as this counting. It's basically the maximum number of slices they can make to a pie in n dimensions with p cuts. It's the same number, right? So for instance, if I give you a pie, like a 2-dimensional pie, right? With 1 cut, you can split it into 2 pieces. With 2 cuts, you'll split it into 4 pieces. But then with 3 cuts, the maximum number you could do is split it into 8 pieces, right? But you can't. You can only split it to 7 pieces with 3 cuts. And that's the number that we want to calculate. Okay, and that's called the Cover counting theorem. And so you can actually show a nice analytic formula that does this counting. This is the number of separable dichotomies of p points in n dimensions. This is this number c that depends upon both the number of points and the number of dimensions n. It's this combinatorial formula, and it's always bounded by 2 to the p. Okay, and if you want to know how to prove this, it's a very simple proof. What you do is it's a recursion relationship. If you tell me that you have a dichotomy of p points, you can think about adding a p plus 1 point, and that will lie on one side of the hyperplane. So that means that c of p plus 1 is the same as c of p in n dimensions. But if you could actually also classify that point in one less dimension by having the hyperplane go through that point, that's an n minus 1 dimensional problem, then you can actually do 2 labelings at that point, not just 1 labeling at that point. So this gives you this recursion relationship. And so we can solve this and you get this combinatorial formula. This is where this comes from. All right. Okay, so let's see what this looks like as a function of p and n. Okay, and this is something called the perceptron capacity, right? So if I give you these p points in n dimensions, and I basically take the ratio of the number of linear separable dichotomies over the total number of dichotomies, it's like saying if I gave you a randomly labeled data set, what's the probability that you can actually classify it using a linear hyperplane? Okay, and what you see is that this ratio for p less than n, this is this line here. For any time you have less points in number of dimensions, that's called the VC dimension, the Vapnis-Chervonenkis dimension of this problem. You can always classify your points. Okay. Now, typically for small dimensions, you'll then have some smooth curve that tells you that this probably decays as you add more and more points. But in high dimensions, what you can see is that if I plot this curve as a function of the number of points over the dimensionality, you get a super sharp transition where basically if p is less than 2 times n, you can always classify your points. And if p is larger than 2 times n, you can never classify your points. This is called a phase transition, okay, in high dimensions. And this is then known as a kind of perceptron capacity. The problem is that, basically any random set of points, p points in n dimensions, if they're p and n are both large, if p is less than 2 times n, you can always linearly classify them. All right? Okay, so this is the motivation behind going to large neural networks, is basically you want to go to high dimensional feature spaces where things become, the geometry in this sense, become simpler in terms of classification, right? So this is the motivation of older systems like support vector machines, which was to explicitly map your points using this kind of kernel method to try to map points into this high-dimensional feature space. Or nowadays, we use kind of these large, very large neural networks where you can think about each layer as this very high-dimensional embedding of your feature, of your inputs, right? So that's why we use these large networks, is because this kind of geometry comes into play. All right? Is that clear? Any questions about that? This is kind of all the basic theory of kind of neural networks from 10, 20 years ago. Okay, now the problem is, how do we actually train new modern neural networks? We're actually going to the infinite data limit, right? We're really trying to put as much data into the problem as possible. And even with a finite data set, all the new tricks of neural networks is to basically do sophisticated data augmentation to kind of generate more and more data for my system, right? So in order to get a neural network to really work well, for the best performance, you take some input and you do all this augmentation on it to generate essentially pseudo examples of that single image, of that single example that explodes in number, okay? So we're going to this infinite data limit, right? In this analysis, P, the number of points, is going to infinity. So how do we understand what happens in this case? Right? How do we understand what your neural network can do under this type of situation? Okay? Okay, so the way we can do this is now more in geometry, right? Instead of thinking about points, when we do augmentation or this kind of transformations, we're now generating manifolds in this high-dimensional vector space. Okay, and that's what we call a data manifold, right? And the idea here is, for example, if I take an image of a dog and I rotate it around, right? This transformation gives me some sort of manifold in this high-dimensional space as I do this kind of set of rotations. I can also scale them, right, these images. So scaling, rotations, all these things are generating these data manifolds in this high-dimensional space, right? So continuous sources of data variability give rise to these manifold structures, right? So then the question is, can we come up with something that explains how well we can classify or process these data manifolds in a neural network system, all right? And so, there's actually something called a manifold hypothesis in the machine learning community. And the idea is the following, is that when you give me kind of a data set, you have all these points, and then you imagine all these augmentations on it. Then I have these data manifolds, essentially. And these data manifolds have very complicated geometries. And so what you need to do with your neural network is basically somehow warp the geometry of these data manifolds so that at the end of the day, as it goes through processing, somehow this geometry becomes simpler so that at the final layer of your neural network, you can do this kind of simple linear classification or some simple kinds of readout that will actually allow me to understand this very complicated data set, right? That's the idea with this manifold hypothesis, right? So what we wanted to do was try to kind of do this more technically and rigorously. So this is a collaboration. I have a long-standing collaboration. Chaim Sampolinsky, who was at Hebrew University and now at Harvard. Su-Young Chang, who's also at Harvard now. Uri was also a postdoc, and he's currently at Cambridge. And so these are the set of papers. And so what we wanted to do was try to understand now, to generalize kind of Kover's theorem, instead of points in a high-dimensional space, if you give me a set of data manifolds, so P data manifolds now in n dimensions, under what conditions can we expect to be able to, say, linearly separate these data manifolds? That's the idea. All right? So that's the math kind of foundation. All right, so the way we do this is that each manifold, you can think about the kind of relevant quantities, the convex hull of this manifold, because it's under linear separability. So what's the convex hull of each manifold? We can write down some sort of representation of this convex hull. And then what we want to try to do then is try to understand, how many of these kinds of manifolds would we be able to separate, okay? So there's a couple simple cases that you should always think about. So one case is if I shrink the manifolds down to a single point, then I recover Tom Kover's theorem, which says that the kind of critical ratio of number of manifolds to dimensionality goes back to 2, so that when they're small, I can classify a lot of them. Now, the problem is that if I make them very large, these manifolds become basically hyperplanes in the high dimensional space. And then if they're hyperplanes, you're essentially reducing the dimensionality of your problem so that your classifier becomes, it's not a high dimensional system anymore. And so your basically the capacity goes way down by the dimension of the hyperplanes. Okay. Another point is if I have random points in a convex hull, that kind of spreads all out. That's kind of like a m-dimensional hyperplane essentially. Then that's also reducing the capacity. So somehow these neural networks that we're using is somewhere between these two limits, kind of the small point limit and this kind of large, huge manifold limit. So the question is, what is the relevant quantity to understand what the geometry of a manifold should be in order to be able to process it well, right? And so this is theoretical. I won't go into the details, but it builds upon earlier work by Elizabeth Gardner, who was a statistical physicist. And what you have to do is you have to calculate kind of the volume of hypothesis space. And when that volume of hypothesis space shrinks to zero is kind of the phase transition, the critical point. So she can show using replica theory how to calculate this. I won't go into details. But what we see is that for a manifold, you can characterize a manifold in terms of two kind of relevant quantities. There's something like an effective manifold radius, right? How large it is in terms of radius. And there's something like an effective manifold dimensionality, right? And we have formulas for this in terms of how to calculate this for data. And what you can then show is that the kind of capacity, how many of these manifolds you can classify, has a nice simple formula in terms of this radius and dimensionality. Okay? And so the idea here is then that you can now really characterize what a neural network does by measuring the representations at each layer and showing which operations are doing something to the radius and which operations are doing something to this effective dimensionality, and tracking that to understand kind of as you go farther and farther into the neural network, how it's actually reformatting this geometry in the layers. So that's the idea and understanding what this neural network can do. Another interesting thing is just like in support vector machines, you can have support vectors, which are basically, if you have a maximum margin classifier, you can have points on the margin planes. In the same way, you can have manifolds that touch the margin planes in different ways, right? So we can have a whole kind of hierarchy of different types of support manifolds, and these are the ones that are the most important for the classification. And so you can actually understand that from a geometrical perspective as well. All right, so what we can do is, this is just some results. We can take some, kind of benchmark neural networks, ResNet, VGG, this is for images. We then take some sort of set of input manifolds, right? So this is a affine warp manifold where you take images and do these kind of warpings. You can also think about different types of manifolds that come directly from, like, say, ImageNet, right? The point cloud, so all the kind of husky dogs in your ImageNet set is some manifold there. And what we can then try to do is understand what happens to the geometry of these manifolds as they progress through these different types of neural networks. So this is what Uri and Suyan did. They tracked, measures like the dimensionality of the manifolds, the radius of the manifolds, and what happens as you go layer by layer. What happens when you do learning, what happens under one learning algorithm versus another learning algorithm. And what you can then really see is kind of which ones are effectively doing the right things to the geometry, so that at the end of the day, right, that this learned neural network is really doing the kind of reformatting of the geometry properly, so that the data set looks much simpler at the output layer. Okay, so that was the idea behind this analysis. Yeah.
So it seems like in some cases, the way that you group the data in manifolds is based on the set of data augmentations of a single sample. And in some others, it's maybe something else. Like, can you maybe kind of explain whether that choice is critical to understanding the separability of the data, and how should one make that choice?
Yeah, so the question was, how do we actually define what should be a manifold? Like, is it just an augmentation of a single point, or is it depends on, I think, what you want the network to do, right? So if you just say that the network has a lot of, say, image classes that it wants to separate, like one from the others in some sense, then you can think about each class, like all the husky dogs would be like a manifold. But if you wanted to think about, okay, I really need to do some regression problem or something like that and calculate some statistics that are irrelevant to a particular augmentation, then you would imagine those to be the manifolds, right? So that's it. So you can think about different manifolds for different kinds of analysis purposes. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a question about these plots. the dimensionality doesn't seem to change very much as you go up the layers, and then it crashes. So the crash presumably happens because of neural collapse, because you have to classify correctly. If the dimensionality doesn't change as you go up the layers, then what is the network doing?
Yeah.
In this analysis perspective?
Yeah. So the question was, I think, tracking the dimensionality. Sometimes it seems like there's these sharp things that happen in the neural network. It all depends upon the learning algorithm, because if you think about what it's doing backprop through the layers. And so what it's trying to do is actually trying to do as well as it can in the output layer, given the input represent. And so it's slowly trying to, in some sense, when backprop, it's actually learning things from the last layer in. But then if you look at the operations, like for instance, in a ReLU network, like ReLU, basically that operation will basically, it's a nonlinearity. So it compresses things, so it shrinks the radius. But the problem is that ReLU actually increases the dimensionality because it makes it more nonlinear, right? And so what happens is that you have a trade-off between operations in a neural network. Like the ReLU operation does something to the radius, but increases the dimensionality. And at some points, you need to do some batching or whatever it is to basically shrink the dimensionality back down. But then the radius can go up. And so there's these kind of trade-offs between the different operations that are occurring. And you can see that in kind of what's happening on an individual layer basis. Okay.
The local radius and the local dimension, the thing that
yeah, the manifold radius and dimension is, hopefully what's happening so that at the last layer, you can actually do this kind of classification well, right? So, and this is under maximum margin type of things too. So you also want to separate them in some sense as well as possible. Okay. Yeah, Alex?
So I understand that you can use this analysis to understand how the network works, but do you also use it to tweak your training data set that you're generating, or would that cause some kind of overfitting? Like if you make the training set easily separable already, but is that good or bad? That's probably bad, right? Because it's not.
Yes. So the question was whether you can use these kind of geometry measures to change your data set. I mean, right now, this was just to use it for analysis of how a particular learning algorithm works. But you can imagine incorporating this type of analysis to better do learning. And that's some things that people have been working on, is to use these measures instead of just a simple backprop error to actually then sculpt the network itself. So that's an interesting direction.
Right. If you make it the training set easy for your network to separate, then it would be like overfit. You're just giving it easy problems.
Yeah. If you have two, I think that if in some sense the training data is too simple, then you don't need a huge network to do it, right? You can do it with the simpler methods. Question there?
Like the network is good. Like for example, you're saying that like if the radius and dimension are changing and sometimes they change opposite of each other, like it's sort of clear in terms of your analysis that the network is doing something productive. But in certain layers where neither one is changing, does that sort of indicate maybe those layers aren't necessary? Or do you still think that there's something unquantified that radius and dimension don't show that those layers are actually doing? It's just that they're not changing.
Yeah, so good question is about like kind of, well, what does it mean when things don't change, and what does it mean about your architecture? So definitely it would be nice to always be able to say that, when we use a model, it does something nice and kind of monotonic and does everything properly. But it doesn't, right? And it might have to do with how you initialize the weights. It might have to do with how you do backprop. And so it's all these things are dependent upon those details. So this is why we're hoping that using these kinds of tools will allow people to better understand how to train a network or how to even select the architecture in the first place, right? Why is it in some problems you can get away with 3 layers in a network, and the other problems you need 20, right? I mean, it has to do with kind of how much can you do in each layer and what happens to the geometry of that problem and how complicated the initial geometry was in the first place, right? That's all these details that you have to worry about. Yeah, question there?
You can assume that the labels themselves impose some geometry onto the data space and the latent space as well. How do these interpretations differ when you do like an unsupervised, let the model learn these manifolds on its own, as opposed to I'm going to impose my own manifold on the model itself through the labels?
Yeah, so again, I think this question is related to kind of what do you mean by a manifold? And as I said, it does depend upon the task. So if it's really just classification of, say, a whole bunch of image categories, then I can think about each image category as a manifold. But if I'm thinking about doing something else like pose estimation or something like that, then I have to think a little bit more in terms of regression problem, perhaps, and then I have to understand like which aspects of the manifold are kind of irrelevant to the output layer, and that's the ones that I need to model as a manifold. All right, great. Okay, I have 10 minutes, I think. So let me now turn to kind of how we can think about using these types of techniques in better understanding, unknown types of networks. And the motivation for this is you look at these kind of like large language models, right? You can see that evaluation of these AI models using kind of query response, these kind of black box techniques, is not sufficient, right? So, right now, these LLMs are basically solving the Turing test kind of from outside appearances. So there's a lot of now debates about, well, is an LLM really intelligent? Is it super intelligent? Is it less? I mean, and the question all comes down to a lot of these kinds of debates about whether these systems are really just stochastic parrots, right? How they different from how we as humans think about problems, right? There's a famous Searle's Chinese room, which says that you can solve a Turing test by basically having a huge lookup table, essentially, and being able to answer things that way, but that's not intelligence. And so these are all the kinds of debates that we're hearing nowadays in AI. So what we really need to do is really think about, instead of just looking at input-output relationships in a black box, we need to look inside the black box, and again, at these neural representations, right? We need to understand what's happening to things like the geometry of these representations inside. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. It's not that these techniques are not just appropriate for trying to come up with a better model, but really trying to understand what's happening inside the model itself and whether this model hopefully is similar to what a human brain does or is not similar to what a human brain does. Okay, so you need to open up this black box, look at these internal neural representations, and be able to somehow compare and contrast them with, say, another model or with an animal brain, right? So we want to understand how to measure these differences. Yeah. All right, so here's the idea, right? Suppose I gave you a ResNet model, whatever latest neural network model that people are using, and then you went in and did some neuroscience experiments and you measured a human brain, and then maybe you measured an animal, like a dog doing the same task, okay? Using electrode, using fMRI, whatever imaging techniques you might have to see inside these brains, okay? Then the question is, how do we figure out, is this neural network as good as a dog? Or is this neural network approaching humans? Or or how similar is a human to a dog in doing this task, right? How do we actually quantify this? That's the question, all right? Okay, so that's the idea. And so what we have for data now in representations is the following, right? Usually when you do this kind of experiments, either an artificial or a biological experiment, you give it some set of inputs. So you have some sort of input stimuli. You can think about it in the visual system, right? You have a set of input images. And then you have a bunch of recordings of your neurons in some layer, say. And these are the neural features that we're recording. So I can just think about this representation is given by a matrix. This matrix is for each row here, it's a different input stimulus. Each column here is basically a different neuron. And you're just looking at the activity of that neuron under that stimulus, right? That's the one way I can think about this representation, okay, as this data matrix. Okay, so the standard way to process this is something known as a gram matrix. I take this representation matrix, let's call it phi, and I just calculate phi transpose. Okay, that's called a gram matrix. This will give me something like the number of stimuli by number of stimuli, and I can look at kind of how different stimuli are correlated with each other using this gram matrix. It's a very simple multiplication of this representation matrix. I get this gram matrix, and now we use this empirical gram matrix to kind of understand this representation. That's a standard approach to doing this. Okay, and so what would you do with this gram matrix? The one simple thing would be to take the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of a gram matrix. This is called the spectrum of the gram matrix. And similarly, the same way, it's totally related to just calculating the moments of this gram matrix, right? The moments are one-to-one relationship to the eigenvalues, all right? So if I do that, you can see this is what's done in the literature. All these papers about analyzing brain representations and things like that. The standard approach, calculate this Graham matrix, look at the eigenvalues, plot the eigenvalues with kind of the kind of, you put them in descending order, and you look at the spectrum, and you try to see whether the spectrum falls off. Is there a certain dimensionality to it? These are the types of analysis people are doing. Okay? All right. So that's the idea. But the problem here is that there's estimation bias when you do this. Okay, what is estimation bias? Right, the simplest example of a bias in a statistical estimator is when you calculate the variance. Okay, so here's a standard simple statistics problem. I give you a set of one-dimensional points, right, samples from some distribution in one dimension. What you can do is simply you can calculate the mean. That's very simple. That's 1 over n to the sum of the points. That's an unbiased estimator. However, if you do the simple thing, right, if you kind of, when you remember initially studying statistics, if you calculate the variance by basically looking at the sum squared deviation of the points from the mean, and you divide by 1 over n, number of points, that's actually a bias estimate of the variance, okay? So the proper way to do this is something like you actually divide by 1 over n minus 1. This is called the Bessel correction to the variance estimator. How many people have seen this before? Hopefully you've seen this, okay? Now, I remember when I heard about this, I was like, what the heck, man? Why do I do n minus 1, right? Okay, and there's always some statistician that gives you some mumbo jumbo about number of degrees of freedom. And I mean, it doesn't make sense, right? So, the proper way, the way I think you should understand this is that if I take the endpoints and I resample by basically eliminating some fraction points, and I recalculate the variance according to this rule, and I average over that resamplings, I should get the same answer. That's what I think about having zero bias. There's something called the jackknife estimator and things like that. So the jackknife estimate using this, this formula should be the same no matter the number of points that you're sampling from. And that's the definition of zero bias. That to me makes sense. So if you do this estimate under that, you can see that 1 over n gives you an error. 1 over n minus 1 doesn't give you this error. Okay, and that to me is a better way of understanding why the heck you use this. All right? Now, the question is, if I take a matrix and I want to understand the moments of this matrix, doing the simple covariance calculation and looking at kind of the moments of these covariance matrices actually turns out to be a biased estimate of the underlying kind of process, okay? And so the question we had was, suppose I did this with a matrix, I gave you this representation matrix, and I did this kind of resampling. Would I get the same answer under resampling as with the original matrix? And if you just use the naive covariances, you don't. Okay, so it's biased. So the question is, how can we actually get unbiased estimates from a representation matrix? Right? So this is the last part of the work. So this is actually some work that recently published by a student, PhD student of mine, who just graduated, is now a postdoc at Harvard, Chanu. And so, it's to understand how do we calculate the spectral moments of this kind of matrices from sampling, finite sample matrices. So the idea is, again, suppose I do a biology experiment. I have an animal. I go in and I show it P different images, and I measure Q different neurons. Right? This is always a sample, right? I can't show it all possible images. I can't measure all the neurons in the brain. Okay, so it's always finally sample. So it's very important to eliminate the bias of understanding this representation. So the way you do this is, I'll give you a quick example. Suppose I want to calculate the second moment of this matrix. If I go in and look at kind of the covariance estimator, it's basically a product of 4 different coefficients, a sum over all products of 4 different coefficients in this neural representation matrix. There's products that look like rectangles like this. There's products that look like actually degenerate rectangle, vertical rectangle. There's a product of a horizontal rectangle, and there's basically a delta function type of rectangle. Okay? When you calculate the covariance in a naive way, you sum up over all these guys. But if you look at this, these degenerate rectangles actually are biased, highly biased. This has to do with the Marchenko-Pasteur distribution and everything in statistics, but these are the terms that are not good for you. So if you want to really eliminate the bias, you can basically unsum these guys and only keep the non-degenerate rectangles when you do the sum. This will be an unbiased estimate of the covariance second order moment. Okay, you can do the same thing with higher order moments. Is instead of doing sums over degenerate kinds of quantities, you only want to sum over these non-degenerate things. We have a dynamic programming way of doing this very quickly. And so you can calculate all the moments of a representation matrix using this trick, which are then unbiased. Okay? So then if you do this properly, you can calculate things like the affected dimensionality of the representation. These other statistics, if you look at higher order moments, has to do with like kind of curvatures of the representations. So you can do all this kind of analysis using now these unbiased estimators rather than the standard gram matrix approaches. And then you can actually analyze things like real neural data. So this is data from a mouse, a visual cortex of a mouse. It shows that, under standard analysis, if I vary the number of stimuli, I vary the number of neurons, the estimates are all over the place. So no one understands what happens to a brain of a mouse if you use the standard naive estimator. But with our estimator, you can actually measure very easily that under any type of resampling, you get the same answer. So that's a very consistent answer, even with limited amount of data. So that's the idea with this estimator. You can do the same thing with an artificial neural network. If I vary the number of widths of a neural network and I look at learning, typically like a network with 32 neurons looks different than a network with 128 or 512 neurons. But under these kinds of estimators, they look much, much more similar, so that these neural networks kind of have an invariant form using this kind of estimator to estimate their geometry. So that's another application. Okay, so I think I'm running out of time, but just to summarize, we see that the current AI systems are approaching this kind of infinite data and infinite model size limits. Okay, so what we need to do is really understand what's happening inside these types of systems by looking at the inner kinds of representations. How do we understand the geometry? And then how to actually estimate this geometry properly using the right statistics when we have samplings of this, say when we do a biological experiment. So these are the important things that we need to be able to do properly so that we can have a better understanding of these models, and hopefully this will lead to future progress, and better robots in the future, like a snow shoveling robot, when a winter storm comes. So that was what we're talking about. So thank you very much. Love to hear more from you. Oh, these were like so the question is, what's the y? So these are the affected dimensionality of the representations as they get learned. So this is like what's showing is kind of in this neural network. If I vary the number of neurons and it's learning, the kind of dynamics of learning under kind of a naive estimator, which is the top row, look all different. But if you use the proper kind of estimator, this unbiased estimator, then they all kind of look much more similar. So hopefully the idea would be that, you can do an experiment with a smaller neural network, try to understand what the right geometry is, and then kind of carry that over to help you speed up, say, a larger neural network in their learning. So yeah, this is just the kind of what happens to the dimensionality of the representation under learning.
So this is something like explained variance.
The what?
Explained variance.
It's more like, again, the kind of the collapse of the dimensionality when during learning, which is like shrinking the manifold essentially of the representation down. And this is in one particular layer of this network.
Thank you.
Hey, Dan.
Hey, Costa.
That's really moving to listen to you having the same like scholar attitude as 20 years ago. I love it.
We've all gotten older in 20 years, right?
I love it, yeah. So there are neurons, even like in biological brains, that are tuned, for example, to orientation or to specific transformations, right? And from them, we can really predict like the orbit inside this manifold for simple transformations, not intra-class variation. How does this affect really like the the calculation in terms like of the convex hull and?
Yeah, it's a great question, Costa. So yeah, so if you're saying like, for instance, like an equivariant network, right, that you can have a representation, a proper representation. Yeah, so that's typically what happens in the earlier layers, I think, in the neural network. And then if you want to actually make an invariant to that, then it somehow has to kind of collapse that dimension down, right, in the layers. So the question is, how is it really, what's the best way of doing that kind of compression, essentially, of those variables? Right. Exactly, right? So initially, right, if you think about the initial data, it could be huge orbit, right? So it could be very large. That effect of rotation will be huge. And the question is, if I want to be invariant to that, then somehow in the network, it has to kind of make a representation that doesn't have that huge kind of effect, right? So that's the idea, is how do you measure that?
I have, I think, kind of a clarification question,
Mhm.
and this might just be rooted in a misunderstanding, but in the way that you motivated that first work on kind of, measuring the radius and dimensionality of the data manifolds, just trying to connect the dots there, like you start by saying that these properties of the unlabeled data will determine the extent to which you can classify any arbitrary labeling of the data, right? That's at least how I understood it. But then afterwards, when we're measuring the radius and so it feels like basically that theory would inform the extent to which the representations learned inside a neural network are applicable to problems other than the original problem that they were trying to train. Let's say on ImageNet data. So it feels like it's a theory about kind of the transferability of the representation. Is that fair?
It is, yeah. So, I mean, it's a theory. So you have to make some sort of assumptions on what that theory means. So here, yes, you said the first part was about, okay, you have these inputs, and suppose I wanted to, and the idea was that kind of, if I need to separate half the classes from the other set of half classes in some sense, right? Like I have a whole bunch of manifolds, huskies, whatever, and then I suddenly said, oh, I want all the dogs on one side and all the cats on another side, right? Then that would be kind of what this theory explains, is how easy is that to do and what the right representation for me to be able to do that. But now instead of separating all the dogs and cats, suppose I wanted to separate all the whatever colored, orange colored animals from all the brown colored animals. Then again, that's another separation. So
and the analysis for that would have to assume a different notion of what the data manifolds are that you're measuring these properties with respect to, right?
You don't have to, because now you can just say that each, say, orange tabby cat is a manifold, and brown tabby cat is another manifold, and gray Dalmatian is another one.
Yeah.
Those are all the manifolds.
Yeah.
And now, in some sense, when you classify by color or by classify by animal, then it's something like a random assignment of these manifolds.
As long as they're kind of super categories of the original categories that you used as manifolds.
Yes, so that's the idea behind the theory. That's kind of the theoretical foundation of it.
Gotcha. Thank
Because
you.
you need to have, in order to do statistics, you have to have some sort of randomness in this process, and that's where that comes from, is kind of the assignment process, and that's what allows you to do the calculation. Otherwise, if it's all fixed in advance, there's nothing we can say statistically, because I can construct anything that will then, make it difficult to analyze.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
I have one more.
Okay.
It's more like related to a student asked also this question. A lot of problems. How do we, like a generalized, go with the software transition, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So the question is kind of, if you wanted to output like softmax probabilities or something like that, how would you analyze that? Okay.
That follows, but it can be the output can be a prediction, right?
Yeah. So again, like a regression type of problem. We haven't done it, but there's other people that I know that have been trying to think about these kind of geometrical types of analysis to understand when you have good generalization performance for regression as opposed to classification. And that would be much more like as you say, a analog type of output that you're looking at. So no, there's definitely a lot of work, people interested in and trying to understand that as well. Okay.
Thank you for your talk. So in the beginning, you prefaced that some of these programs from 10 or in the general 10 to 20 years from there has produced some kind of very impressive results. We've probably are in this like new age of like ChatGPT and all these type of systems. Where do you see 10 to 20 years? Like, what would be impressive to you guys
I mean, I don't think any of us can really predict 10, 15 years. I mean, I think the lesson that I learned is that you should just work on problems that you think are cool and interesting, even if everyone else says, you know, what the heck are you working on humanoids, or what the heck are you working on quad rotors? Why are you working on, you know, weird cars, right? And getting caught by the police, you know, well, why are you doing that, right? If they say that, don't worry about it. If you think it's interesting and your friends have a group of a community that actually agrees with you, then just go ahead and do it. Someday, you know, people will say, you know, this is something that was useful, right? So I think that's the lesson. So instead of trying to predict 10, 15 years and trying to follow that, you should just do what you think is cool. That's my lesson. All right.
Just to conclude, I have one small question of the similar nature.
Uh-huh.
I'm asking for a friend. They're beautiful, they're abstract, they're crisp. How does it help us build better robots?
Well, okay, so the question of how do we actually get to a better robot? I think it has to do with how to build better large neural networks. As I said, we're running into kind of data limits now. We're, you know, how do we actually put in some better types of algorithms together? Like, what are the kind of cost functions that you should be using rather than trying to backpropagate, you know, all sorts of funky errors from the, you know, last layer? So is there some other principled ways of actually trying to learn and, you know, actually construct these neural networks? I think that would be, I think, what's useful for robots, because we know there's a lot of kind of structure in the data that come into robots. So the neural network should actually be able to handle that structure in certain ways. So I totally agree with not trying to do tabula rasa, just throw bigger and bigger things and just collect more and more data and somehow that's going to magically work. I don't believe in that. Okay? Thanks. Thanks so much.